Thank you for tuning into Mindset Lab. We recognize that the topics that we are covering can be potentially triggering to emotional trauma and or any feelings in general. If you're looking for any sort of support, please reach out to any one of these resources. If you are in need of immediate support, please call 911. Otherwise, enjoy today's conversation. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for episode 4 of Mindset Lab. In all my experience in sport and realizing these conversations these past couple of weeks, I've realized how much talking about abuse in sport actually weighs on me. It's been a challenge to be a part of the conversations and listening in the conversations. And for myself and my own experience, I've had negative and positive experiences, but I've been lucky enough not to be involved personally on a personal level, and I've kind of been sheltered in that way. So being a part of those conversations, I've realized has kind of affected every area of my life. And I'm realizing that. So we've offered some support systems at the start of this episode that is going to be in the pre-recording. And that's a really important place to start, I think. And that's also why I'm very happy that we were joined today by Dr. Melanie Lang, who is going to be focusing on athlete wellness mindset. If you are unaware of Dr. Lang's work, she is here with us today, and she's the Assistant Director of the Center for Child Protection and Safeguarding in Sport, otherwise known as CPSS, at Edge Hill University. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Great. And I think, as per usual, Dr. Jennifer Fraser is here, and I think your area of expertise, Jen, is super in line with what we're talking about today as well.
Yeah, I think we're going to have an excellent conversation. And I also want to echo Jamison's point about this can be a very heavy conversation. When you talk about abuse, it can trigger people. It can weigh down on people. It can make people, especially young people, I think, feel very powerless. So I really like the direction that Jamison is charting here. We have, a world leading expert in child protection, but she's also a leading expert in what policies can we do? How can we make change? How do different countries handle it? And that type of knowledge is just invaluable for anyone who's feeling overwhelmed. There are all kinds of solutions and ways of making change. So I thought maybe we could start off by one of the things that I work on and I struggle with is the idea of how do we break the cycle, or how do we stop recycling the way a coach might have been trained, which was as an elite athlete, which was really harsh on them, but they believe it's the best way to get success. So maybe Dr. Lang, you could start us off with a conversation around how do we stop the cycle? How can we make positive change and really protect our athletes?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. I think perhaps we almost need to go back a step and understand why this happens in the first place. And I think that certainly the recycling of experience. So we know from research that coaches do tend to reenact what they themselves experience. So that could well be abusive practice or poor practice. That's certainly one of the reasons that particularly forms of emotional and physical abuse occur in sport. So as well, again, if you were going to come back to not say what I was going to say now or repeat it later, but I think there are some of the other reasons, particularly that emotional abuse gets under acknowledged in sport, is the normalization, the normalized behaviors, and the fact that emotional abuse isn't a cut and grey. There are grey areas within behaviours that constitute emotional abuse. And so because some of the behaviours that are abusive, would count as abusive, are normalised, particularly within a sports context, they can go unrecognised. So, the behaviours, like what it takes to succeed in sport, particularly at an elite performance level, but not only, it's tough. Sport is a tough, training is tough to reach an elite level. So I think it's a culture sport where conformity to certain behavior, certain norms and behaviors that can be quite damaging is not only expected, but it's also encouraged. And these behaviors become sort of seen as part of the game. They're a normal part of sport. It's what it takes to succeed. You have to put up with these behaviors. You have to go through the pain. You have to go through the training with injury. You have to, rigidly follow a particular diet. These sorts of behaviors that can constitute emotional and physical abuse have become the sort of dominant model for success. And so when it's rationalized as a function of sport, this is a functional way to behave in sport, it's seen as something that not only leads to improved performance, but is actually necessary for improved performance. That's how it's seen. So I think part of understanding how we prevent and how we manage when it does happen, these forms of abuse, is understanding why it's happening in the first place. And certainly normalized behaviors that are abusive is one of the issues. I think there are other issues, not only the recycling of abuse that we know occurs, the assumption that these behaviours are necessary to develop mental toughness, which is seen as essential for success in sport. And I think there's also stuff going on around how we construct or think about athletes, and particularly children. I think all these things together sort of create this perfect storm of emotional abuse in particular, being so prevalent in sport. And it is so prevalent. It's all the evidence we have thus far suggests that emotional psychological abuse is by far and away the most prevalent form of abuse. Something like, there was a study in England, for example, that showed that 79% of young people, when they were thinking about their experiences when they were children in the sport in the UK, had experienced emotional harm. So significant numbers are affected. Am I talking too much?
Not at all.
Should I carry on?
Carry on.
I'll keep going. Okay. So I think we need to start first and foremost by understanding why these things happen in order to work out what we can do to prevent and equally to manage these issues. So for me, it's really about, I always say, acknowledge, awareness, educate, empower. So acknowledging is the first step, and I wish we weren't in this position, but we are still at the stage where we need to acknowledge. Everyone who works within sport needs to acknowledge and accept that these things happen, and that it's not acceptable. Unequivocally, it's wrong. So the first step towards preventing any welfare concern is recognition by the sports authorities that a problem exists. I think it's about acknowledging where it's appropriate, that an apology to athlete victims is necessary, and have an open discussion about how to proceed. And we're only really, certainly in the UK, we're only really starting to do that now when it comes to emotional abuse in sport. We had an epiphany in the mid-1990s around child sexual abuse and sexual abuse of and exploitation of children and women athletes, adult athletes. And as a result of that was an Olympic swimming coach who I knew. This is how I came to be interested and researching this area. In the mid-1990s, the Olympic swimming coach called Paul Hickson was convicted of raping and sexually assaulting female swimmers under his care. And at the time, he got the longest sentence for any sexual offence in any sector. And that created a storm of publicity. As a result of that, there were several other several other athletes in multiple sports in the UK and further abroad who came out talking about their own experiences of sexual exploitation. and that included some male athletes as well. And so I think in the UK, at least, we did an awful lot of soul searching in the mid 1990s about hierarchical power relations in sport, how coaches could get away with this kind of behaviour for such a long time. Paul Hickson was, it was found that he'd been carrying out these behaviours for close to 20 years, and there'd been multiple complaints about him that had been overruled or ignored. So as a result of that, we had a series of significant policies, as well as sort of more public recognition of sport as a sector where abuse can occur. And sport and parents and athletes became much more aware of this issue and much more attuned to the issue of sexual abuse. But the same didn't occur with other forms of abuse. And I think really this has happened quite recently in the UK again, because we've had a series of independent reviews in different sports: Paralympic swimming, British cycling, tennis, where cases of sexual abuse in some cases, but also of sort of what the newspapers have referred to as toxic sports culture. So incidents of fat shaming, of sexual harassment, of racial abuse, of strictly speaking, some behaviours that I can only really describe as torture. There have been cases of children as young as 7 being tied to the parallel bars that they use in gymnastics, tied there with their wrists and left to hang there while the coach screamed in their face because they failed to succeed at practicing a particular move. So as a result of there's been an awful lot of media coverage in the last 5 or 6 months, particularly focused on British gymnastics, and there is currently an independent review going on into British gymnastics, looking at specifically at emotional and physical abuse of athletes. So suddenly this is an issue that is in the public domain again, that people are starting to question some of these practices that were quite that were common knowledge within the sport. Parents were present in many cases while these behaviours were going on. Other coaches were present. Other athletes were present. Complaints were made and overruled. So the similar sort of cycle that happened in the 1990s with sexual abuse is now occurring, but this time more focused on emotional abuse.
I think about everything that you're saying right now, and there's a lot to break down, I feel like, and I think about athletes at least, and what you're saying about all these coaching techniques that are normalized and become a part of like standard practice in sport and gymnastics in particular. Like we talked about that with Jennifer Say about how there's this total mindset of coaches where you have to break athletes down to their kind of their bare bones, and then you build them up from the ground again. But that is only building them up in one sense of not like, there's no really kind of building up beyond sport. And I mean, you mentioned empowerment, but I'm curious how you approach that conversation with an athlete who either is starting off as a child and is just beginning their experience in sport, or how do you approach that conversation about educating athletes in general?
Yeah, I don't think it's something we can do with athletes alone. I think we have to look at the sport family and educate everyone within the sport family. So, I mean, part of the issue is that athletes are by the nature, by the way that sport is set up structurally, are disempowered. There is this assumption, I think, that coaches are, we think about athletes as objects, as commodities, as things that need to be these kind of empty vessels that need to be filled with the coach's knowledge. They have this, coaches have an alibi of expertise and an alibi of status. And we think of athletes as knowing nothing and waiting to be taught, to be educated by the coach, and we've got athletes who are thought of as commodities, as things, as athletes first, and children, if we're thinking about children, second, or people second. So I think part of the problem is that, and because of that, we can't only educate athletes because they are structurally disempowered within sports culture. So even if they do speak out, because in many cases, certainly in the case of sexual abuse when Paul Hickson was convicted in the 1990s, and equally in the case of many of the examples of abuse that have been disclosed relating to British gymnastics over the last few months, many of these athletes had spoken out previously, but were overlooked or overruled. So there is certainly an issue with educating, and certainly I think athletes need to be part of that, a central part of that. But I think we need to educate the broader sport family, so parents, coaches, other officials as well, so that everybody knows what behaviours constitute emotional abuse, how they can report it, how they can raise concerns, and how those concerns are handled within the organisation, so that they're taken seriously and not seen as just a sort of normal part of sport. There was another part to your question and I went off on one of my tangents and forgot it. Sorry.
That's totally fine. That's totally fine, Genuine.
I was just going to say, I love your the model you've depicted, this idea that the adult, the educator, and this happens in music, this happens in academia, somehow the educator has knowledge that they then pour into the empty vessel. And what I find fascinating, or in the work that I do that really connects with you here, is I'm trying to get educators, coaches or teachers or music teachers, parents, to understand that that's a really outdated model. It's very old-fashioned. And the science has taught us that really what we're doing when we work with children in whatever field, and very true for sports, when we work with children, what we're doing is we're strengthening desired neural networks. And we're replacing neural networks that they don't need and that aren't going to serve them well in life. So Jamison, this goes to your athlete wellness, athlete welfare. It's all connected. And if we could change educators, coaches understanding that if they want a child to succeed at their sport, they have to help them practice. It's experiential. And every time their brain makes a mistake, it's a celebration. It's not berating and it's not shaming. The mistake is how the brain is learning how to strengthen the neural network. So really, this is where I'm trying to just do a paradigm shift around how educators understand their role. And it's empowering for them, because the more our coaches understand that they have this incredibly important job, this sacred trust, basically, to be the one that fulfills the potential of all their athletes and allows them to have the healthiest brains and bodies. That's truly important, inspiring work. So yeah, I think that's where one of the ways we need to move forward with this. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Dr. Lang.
Yeah, I absolutely couldn't agree more. It is an outdated model, but it's entrenched within sport. Sport culture is hierarchical, and we know that within hierarchical cultures, whether that's the military, the workplace, any other hierarchical culture, then abuse is more likely to happen. So you have athletes who are disempowered perhaps if they're children, they're structurally disempowered, they're disempowered in a different way, or an additional way, by their assumed lack of expertise. They're disempowered by often their size comparative to the coach, in some cases by their gender. So it is an outdated model, but it is a model that is entrenched within sport. And I think there are many coaches who are doing, a really good job. And we certainly know, some of my own research some time ago now, but some of my own research suggested that newer qualified coaches were more sort of on board with accepting alternative models of doing, alternative ways of doing things, alternative coach athlete relationship models. But yeah, we've still some way to go, I think, before that's true of all coaches across all sports. Yeah.
I think with some of what you're saying, it's sounding like, specifically when it comes to toughness, I've asked a couple questions about toughness and about this idea that we kind of idolize the end of the road. Like the end of competition is like, well, if it's the Olympics, it's the gold medal that we all want to get. Like Dr. Willinga called it the gold medal standard. But she also said that there's kind of this part of this conversation where athletes and coaches are now starting to realize that it's kind of the environment that you build towards that in that really creates a better athlete and a better person to go beyond sport. I'm curious when there's something that is like kind of at the end of the road, or a competition, or even when there's nothing at the end of the road, when there's nothing to work towards, but it seemed like there is. I'm curious how do you kind of, what are your thoughts on that, on like kind of idolizing this at this final stage?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's difficult because I think there are differences obviously at different levels of sport, but certainly at the elite level. I mean, I was myself an elite athlete. I was an elite swimmer, and there is there is a sense that this is what you have to do to get where you want to be, and I think you kind of do make that cost benefit analysis in your head, and there's certainly research that suggests with elite athletes that suggests that they make a cost benefit analysis of what's my end game and how close am I to achieving that, and therefore to what extent am I willing to put up with these behaviors and this whether they recognize it as abuse or not. To what extent am I willing to be unhappy in order to get where I want? Now, at an elite level, I can understand when you've invested so much time, energy, money, into it, how athletes make that analysis and think it's worth it. We certainly need to do much more to explain to them that isn't the only path, and that there are alternative ways of becoming successful, becoming whatever success looks like. That isn't the only model that exists. When we're looking at lower down the performance hierarchy, I think there are different things at play, but and this is more likely where athletes leave the sport, they drop out of the sport and leave the sport when because they haven't invested so much into it. But in terms of coaches, the model is still the same, because a coach's career and again status and reputation can still be invested in athletes even if they're not competing at an elite level. So I think certainly there's much more we can do to educate coaches and athletes parents on alternative models of success. But I think we also need to recognise that these aren't issues that are unique to more of an elite or more of a performance end of the spectrum. Certainly when it comes to emotional abuse, the evidence suggests that you may be more susceptible to emotional abuse the higher up the spectrum you go, because of the investment, the cost benefit analysis that you've made, but that equally these are behaviours, these are harms that are happening to athletes across the whole performance spectrum, and often the lower ends of the performance spectrum get forgotten about. There isn't as much attention in research and in policy development at that end, and yet these are athletes who are still also being harmed. They may just decide to leave the sport because they haven't invested quite so much in order to carry on, and that in itself is, that's a tragedy, isn't it? We may well be losing athletes, not just from that particular sport, but from all sport or physical activity. So there's a lot more riding on this than winning medals, making elite teams, I think.
Yeah, in North America, the National Alliance of Youth Sports research shows that 7 out of 10 kids quit sports at 13 because they can't, it's just so unbearable. They don't like the way they're being treated. So, I mean, we're losing 70% of potentially Olympic athletes. Like, we don't even know, because we don't know how talented they are, because we drive them away from the sport. And yet we as a culture and society and as a governing body, we understand that health and wellness is deeply interrelated with our sport culture. It's really such a shame. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. I know you've just edited this major volume for Routledge on athlete welfare, and the writers that you are working with, the researchers that you work with, they're talking about how important it is to have inclusion and equity and child rights. I mean, these are all words that we wish were buzzwords in sport. Like, all coaches, you know, wouldn't it be great if we could train our coaches and our athletes and our parents to all have these kinds of words, like how are we protecting child rights first and then putting the sport second? How are we including all children? How do we create a power balance between our adults and our kids? And I just was wondering if you could talk with us about how these different forces could actually make positive change.
The children's rights approach, that's what you mean? There was a lot going on there, sorry.
Yeah, child rights, let's start there. Sorry, okay. I tend to get going with my questions and then
it's great. I don't know where to start. Okay, so I mean, for me, the whole I think empowerment as an ideal is central to preventing these issues from continuing. We have to give athletes or educate athletes on to know that they've got, you know, the confidence, the skills, and the opportunities to challenge and abusive practices, or at least to question, even if they're not sure if something that's happening is normal or acceptable, and to speak out safely. So, you know, athletes can resist. We can teach them assertiveness, we can teach them resistance tactics, and we can support them. So I think we certainly need to do much more to educate and empower, and that's sort of underpinned by human rights and children's rights. In the UK, we have changed many of our laws around children to incorporate the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. But children's rights, and that operates in many different sectors, in the medical sector and in schools, and there is a lot more recognition of children's rights, and there is a lot more opportunity for children to offer their views and to be listened to, in order to try to empower them and to give them a voice, in a say in things that happen to them. In sport, certainly in the UK, and from my knowledge of certainly Europe and Australia, New Zealand, we're not there yet. We haven't really, children's rights haven't really touched sport in the way that they have other sectors. So there is recognition of the way I see it is that there's two sort of forms of two, I want to say constructions of childhood within the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. The first is this idea that children are vulnerable and need protecting. And the second is this idea that children are active agents of change and can and have interesting and useful things to say, and have the right and are capable of having input into things that happen to them. And we're very much still stuck in the construction of children as vulnerable and in need of protection. We've got that. We recognise that children are vulnerable through their status and their positioning, and that they need protecting. But we haven't moved to the second phase of children's rights, which is about recognising them as having a voice and having a useful input into how sport is run. So I think there's an awful lot more that can be done within sport to encourage children, to teach children about their rights, and to encourage them to have more input into how sport is run. I'm aware that different sports do this very differently, and particularly at the professional level, I'm aware of several sports that have things like athlete councils, or athlete ambassadors, or athlete committees that feed information back from athletes into the running of the particular sport. But that doesn't filter down to non-professional levels, and it doesn't, just because there's a committee doesn't necessarily mean children or athletes' rights are fully being understood and respected as well. So it's not a simple tick in the box of, well, we've got an athletes committee, we're doing children's rights, we're doing human rights. There's much more to it than that, and I don't think we, certainly in the UK, I don't think sport has done anywhere near enough on that yet.
Yeah, hearing what you're saying about the like athletes at the top that are starting to form these kind of coalitions, at least. The NBA is an example that comes to mind right away, about the Players Association that has started to, they literally paused play in the NBA because the players realized how much they wanted to make sure their voice was heard regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think that's because that's a result of how much they're paid and how big the organization is. When, like, as you mentioned, when you boil it down to the lower levels, and it kind of goes down to the like youth level of sport, they don't have much of a voice or say in, because they're not being paid millions of dollars. It's something as simple as just playing the sport. But I'm curious how kind of, you touched on it a little bit, but I'm curious about your research with CPSS at Edgehill University. And I'm curious what research you're kind of, where you're focusing your area of research right now when it comes to children in sport.
Yeah, I've got, there's so many things. I've got one project that I'm involved in at the moment with a colleague from Australia and a colleague from Canada. And one of the things we're doing is we're using athletes' stories. The focus of the project is on non-sexual abuse and educating coaches about non-sexual abuse. So emotional, psychological abuse and physical abuse, and also neglect. And we focused on those forms of abuse because in Canada, Australia and the UK, the child protection and athlete welfare training and CPD that coaches do only kind of skims non-sexual abuse. So we focused on those forms of abuse. And the other innovative thing that we're doing is it's a peer education course. So we are educating coaches to then educate other coaches in 3 separate sports. So, for example, in the UK, we're educating a youth football coach about non-sexual abuse using athlete stories, athlete narratives. So they're real life experiences and examples of emotional, psychological abuse and physical abuse. And then that football coach, that youth football coach, is going on and educating his peers about those forms of abuse. So this is sort of in recognition that peer education is incredibly powerful, or at least has the potential to be incredibly powerful. I've done some coach education myself, and one of the questions that I often get is, what do you know about being a coach? I worked as a coach, but many, many years ago for a very short space of time. I'm not embedded in that culture now. I think there's a degree of credibility that comes from peer education that I can't give. So I think that a project like that has the potential to have more impact. So I think that's something that I'm really interested in doing much more of, in terms of focusing on the peer education element and focusing on educating around non-sexual abuse. Another project that I'm in the planning stages of is it's very it could go really well, could go really badly, is looking at having young athletes involved in designing and creating a project around athlete rights, with the ultimate aim that the athletes themselves would devise a training program for other athletes and for coaches. So it'd be a bottom-up education approach, and that again doesn't happen very often in sport, or at all, as far as I'm aware. Yeah. So, and I want, it's a little bit sketchy at the moment, because part of the whole process is it's not about me deciding what the athletes want to focus on. It's about the athletes themselves deciding what they want to focus on. So we've sort of started talking about a range of different welfare issues, everything from disordered eating and eating disorders, to emotional abuse, to self-harm, and homophobia was another issue, and equity and inclusion. And the athletes are still at the stage of deciding which way they want to go with it, really. And so I wanted to get the athletes themselves involved in designing a project, a research project, delivering it, and then producing some education resources at the end. So it's pretty fraught, because ethics committees and research committees want to know exactly what you're doing, and I can't tell them just yet. So it's quite difficult. But I think, it's really rewarding. It's brilliant to see the young people and how invested they are in it. And they're far better placed than I am to know what will interest and appeal and work with other young people, and particularly, with anybody in their sport, because they're embedded in that sport. So I think that's another thing that I'd like to do more of, and I think sport could do so much more to involve athletes in projects like that.
Yeah, it's we started this podcast because we wanted to look at mindset, and I think what you're describing there is a mindset of empowerment, but it's also a mindset of being informed. Like, as you talked about before, if you don't acknowledge that there's a problem and you can't talk about it, and you're therefore not developing your awareness, you can't heal it, you can't address it.
Yeah.
So this is where, my work on invisible injuries is connects with you here, because I think that if we taught coaches and athletes and parents, understanding that they're all in this together, and sport administrators, if we had them all together, understanding that we can give time in practice, every single practice, to athlete welfare and wellness. We can take, 7 minutes and do a mindfulness exercise, do breathing, do a discussion around a child right, do a kind of training, a quick training on the skills necessary to be able to speak up if you are being harmed. And it might be very unique to you, but that doesn't mean you can't speak up, and have some sort of a team parent coach response that validates you and hones your skills at addressing abuse of other players or your own or whatever. Like, I just don't see why we can't do this. And what's really exciting to me in your approach, which is very original, is the research that I look at. So I research a lot on the adolescent brain, and that adolescents respond to other adolescents. They don't listen to adults. It's part of their brain development, right? We all know that. It's like, if you talk to an adolescent, it's like, wah, wah, wah.
Yeah.
You get a teenager talking to a teenager, they're all ears. They want social standing. They want influence. They want to be part of their peer group. It's hugely influential to them. So if you want to change athlete mindset and make it healthy and engaged and empowered, and get them to understand how critical inclusion is, get them to teach each other. I just think that's brilliant. I love it. I think it's going to be a really great breakthrough.
It's something that it astonishes me that it hasn't been done. It really surprises me that sort of thing hasn't been done yet. Certainly in terms of empirical research, the peer education is quite a common thing in other areas, in other sectors, but in sport it hasn't really been. Or in sport and welfare, it hasn't really been done yet. So I'm really hopeful that it's the start of something great. Certainly, I'm learning a lot from the young people. And I certainly think it's going to work for them in their particular sport context. In an ideal world, we'd like to see that cascaded further and further, but that's for the future. Yeah. I think if I could just come in on one thing you said there about, I think what you're saying is, and I think it's so important, is the embedding of welfare within sort of daily practice. And I think one thing that has happened since we started paying attention to, initially it was child protection in the UK, and then it sort of expanded to, we use the term safeguarding, which is more of a preventative approach to stopping problems from happening before it becomes a child protection issue. And only very recently has the discourse broadened out to more of a welfare, which isn't only about children, it's about athletes in general, and it's about a wider range of abuse and harmful behaviours. But I think what's really important about all those things is not to treat the addressing of welfare, whether that's through education or whether that's through sort of just general checking in. That's an important part of ensuring welfare and well-being, is checking in with people. It's no good treating that as something that's an add-on that we can just stick in there every year or two when we do a coach education course or a parent induction where we talk about welfare and then we never talk about it again. I think what you're talking about there is an embedded approach where welfare becomes just a normal part of the daily sports practice, and that has to be the way that we move this forward, because it's not, otherwise it risks becoming a tick box approach that we talk about and we educate on once every couple of years whenever the coach licensing scheme says that a coach needs to have covered this issue, and that isn't going to be good enough to changing culture.
Yeah, it always just makes me laugh when I see that a coach, for example, or a teacher has crossed a line, they've been identified as abusive, and they're sent to a workshop. I'm like, or the better one is, oh, we're going to write a code of conduct. It's like, what? It's not like, it's like if I went and robbed the store, you don't have to tell me afterwards that robbing the store isn't proper conduct. That's not going to change my behavior or help me. What is going to help me is a rehabilitative approach where I'm taught day in, day out, I'm caught. I make a mistake. My athletes are empowered to speak up and say, you don't want to use that language, I'm sure, today, right? And that's adults who have been trained in the model that's highly abusive. They really need support, help, daily practice, and they need that embedded approach themselves. And if we empowered our athletes to understand that welfare comes first and sport comes second, and all kids should be trained in this from the get-go, it really would make a difference. So yeah, I love that idea of that's the greatest word for it. This embedded, like welfare is embedded. And when you talk to professional athletes and you talk to Olympians, the first thing they'll tell you is that the second they got to practice, the coach would say, how are you feeling? What do you want to work on today? Elite athletes who are highly successful are empowered individuals. They are not serving some sort of, hierarchical abusive system. And the research is very clear on that. So.
Yeah. And this is one of the reasons I'm keen on changing the way we talk about this towards an athlete welfare approach, because there is a lot going on at elite levels, a lot of really good work going on about democratizing sport and encouraging athlete input at that elite level. But this almost never, at least in the UK, it just doesn't trickle down to other levels of sport. There aren't athlete committees. People don't ask athletes, the coaches just don't ask the athletes, well, what do you want to do today, or how are you feeling? They don't. They're just expected to do as they're told, to just keep quiet and do what the coach tells you. And perhaps it is something that will trickle down as that happens more and more at the elite level. But I don't think we can wait for that to happen, really.
I actually just wrote a literature review on how youth sports and education at a kind of elementary level or just in adolescence can perpetuate racism. And it was kind of more of a literature reviewing literature basically about that and research in this area of study. And one of the things that it talked about was kind of asking critical questions and not just kind of putting inclusion and diversity or whatever the topic was as a kind of like an add-on, like you mentioned. It's like, well, normalization is part of the problem, but it's also can be part of the solution. So how can you normalize asking critical questions and actually embodying diversity by hiring diverse coaches and having diverse athletes on your team? Like that's what's part of, and what the research says is part of the most successful sport and educating environments. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I absolutely, completely agree. It is something that, so equity and inclusion was included in the very first policy framework for child protection in sport, which was in 2001. So we have it's a non-governmental organization, so funded by the government, but independent from, or funded by part of government and independent from government. It's called the Child Protection in Sport Unit. And essentially, it was the world's first organisation that was dedicated to safeguarding and protecting children within a sports context. And one of the first things it did, it was established in 2001. One of the first things that it did was devise a policy framework for sports organisations to follow. What do they need to do in order to safeguard and protect children in sport? And this was created on the back of the conviction of Paul Hickson, the Olympic swimming coach who sexually abused female athletes, because at that time there was nothing in British sport. You didn't have to have a criminal history check to be a coach. You didn't have to undergo any kind of formal training. You didn't have to undergo there was no child protection policy. You didn't have to undergo any kind of training in welfare. So on the back of that, they introduced this policy framework, and part of the policy framework from the beginning was focused on equity and inclusion. And initially that was focused on recognizing that certain groups of athletes are more at risk of abuse. So we still know so little about this, but disabled athletes, for example, we know from outside of sport that disabled children are 4 times more likely to suffer abuse than non-disabled children. So what little research on the prevalence of abuse in sport has been done has suggested that disabled athletes and ethnic minority athletes are at higher experience higher prevalence of the different forms of abuse. And we can sort of theorize why that might be, but we don't actually know why. So policy within the UK that any sports organisation that receives government funding has to consider equity, and particularly as it relates to athletes and the different risk categories that different athletes are in. But equally, I mean, that diversity and recognising and valuing diversity is as important when it comes to coaching staff as much as it is to athletes. I agree.
And you avoid tokenism that way too, because I feel like tokenism is a very huge issue right now in that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's part of this holistic approach that I think is really, we've talked about it on a whole bunch of different levels and from different angles, but it's this whole idea of equality. You know, a child is equal to an adult, an athlete is equal to a coach. A person from one cultural or ethnic background is equal to a person from another one. I mean, it's all about that, you know, the ways in which we create these constructs that allow injustice to flourish are mind-blowing. Like, I mean, irony is sport is so oftentimes, not always, but it's oftentimes about community and team. You know, and the research is clear that if you don't have a really bonded, empathic team, and you don't have incredibly connected leadership, you don't get results. And we know this in the work world too. I mean, women are constantly not allowed in the boardroom. And yet all the research shows that if you have women on your board, you're a much more successful company. Yeah. So it's like, we shoot ourselves in the foot all the time as a society. It's really, it's kind of amusing, but it's not funny at all, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it comes back to this, embedding and connecting, and the equity, equality approach, and making sure that is a fundamental part of how a sports organisation is run. It's not a tick box after effect.
Yeah. Or tokenism. I love that word.
Yeah,
that's a perfect way to express it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's that do as I say and not as I do. Oh no. If you are the coach, you're the role model. If you're the sport organization, you're the role model. If we want children to mirror back to us values that we cherish, then we've got to teach and show, and everything we do has to express them. But takes awareness.
That's such a better way of doing it than, as you said, than having a piece of paper that is a code of conduct or a code of ethics. That essentially that's the aim of these things, is to teach people appropriate conduct. What are the values that we want to embody within our sports organisation? That's what they're trying to do through these codes of conduct. But it's a useless piece of paper that nobody pays any attention to. That isn't the way to embed those values within your culture. You have to do it through practice and effort. You have to constantly make the effort to embed that within practice.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm actually realizing that, just to not to talk too much about myself, but I'm realizing that in one area of my life right now, which is I recently joined the board of directors on an Institute of Learning on Gabriel Island called the Haven, and they're kind of starting to shift, or we're starting to shift how we approach inclusion and diversity as a practice and as a policy and policies. And one of the things is where, although it felt like tokenism to start, we're starting to ask critical questions about how does this program or this activity look for Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And I mean, that's to do with race, but it can really go to any kind of area of diversity and inclusion. And kind of, although it seems weird, it's like, how can you ask these critical questions as per the situation each time? Like, there's not going to be a kind of a blanket answer to these kind of situations. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on just having an individual approach to each kind of situation.
An individual approach to
an individual approach when it comes to, I mean, I'm realizing that when you come to one issue of diversity and inclusion, no two issues are the same. So I'm curious. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I would completely agree. We have to consider, all these issues as connected and on a repeated, regular basis. Yeah. Fly.
I'm just was saying that I feel that is yet another, like, sort of opening up a really fabulous discussion, but I'm conscious of your time. It's almost the hour, and maybe we could have you back at some point and unpack that, because I think it's a really important question and it ties in with your work on narrative and lived experience. Jamison, what I'm hearing you're saying there is that we have a bad habit of making assumptions about how someone will experience something when we don't know their background. Now, if you're First Nations and you're coming into a course and everyone in the course is European descent, how does that make you feel? And is the work, does it even speak to you? Does it acknowledge your experience? And that's going to change if you're someone with a disability, and that's going to change if you're someone that's LGBTQ or Two-Spirit, or and yet we have this kind of one-size-fits-all model. And you've been describing this, Dr. Lang, in sport, where the coach just looks at the kids and says, "You're going to do this." That is not at all allowing children to be unique, to have different backgrounds or needs or concerns or crises. I mean, that's just, that blanket approach doesn't work. We know that. So Jamison, maybe we can hold that really important question, because I don't want to let it go, but I also feel like, oh, Dr. Lang, we've had you for an hour and you're an incredibly busy researcher.
think there are people that would more authoritative than me, that I could point you to, that look at welfare. Particularly, I'm thinking of a colleague that I know who looks at welfare and disabled children in sport, who'd certainly be able to speak to that far more authoritatively than me. I know, a lot of her work talks about, again, this how, thinking about disabled people and inclusion, and thinking about the welfare of disabled people as an add-on, and that is not a helpful approach. So I'm happy to put you in touch with her if it's something you want to, if you're able to pursue it in future. Yeah.
That would be great. I mean, I feel like all these conversations are kind of pointing in different directions, but they're all kind of at the center of shaping new conversations in sport, and how can we challenge ourselves to learn as much as possible as we go in sport. So thank you for everything that you've brought to today's conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. It's been great. Thank
Amazing.
you. And I've learned a lot as well.
We really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
It's great.
So that's right. Thank you so much, Dr. Lang, for joining us today. On next week's episode, we're going to be joined by Dr. Helen Reese, who is a professor at Harvard and is working with empathy in her practice. So we are going to be working that into our conversation about mindsets. Thank you for tuning into today's episode of Mindset Lab, and we'll see you next week.